KY3, we're joined today by John Sellers, Executive Director Emeritus of the History Museum on the Square. Yeah, and it's a beautiful facility, redone just a few years ago.
We opened in August of 2019 in the new facility, totally redone, remodeled. It's state of the art. It absolutely is.
I've been in it. It's a major upgrade from the previous building.
Absolutely.
Yes. We're talking today about Wild Bill Hickok, and he has quite the history here in Springfield.
Absolutely.
But let's go back to his early years. Tell me about his
early
years.
He grew up in Illinois. His family were abolitionists. They were staunch unionists, and he was involved in things there. He was always kind of on the fringes of, he was a mischief maker.
Okay.
We'll put it that way.
Okay, yeah.
And he left there and went out west, worked for a time. He was a mule skinner and drove coaches and helped in all sorts of ways. And at that time, that was how you worked. And then with the coming Civil War, he began to work for the U.S. government, for the military mainly, as a once again, a mule skinner, and drove wagons and so on. And then in 1863, Springfield was under martial law, and he was hired by the provost marshal to come here and be a patrolman in Springfield and patrol the city and keep the peace, because Springfield was a fairly evenly matched with Confederate and Union sympathizers. So there was a lot of friction here, a lot of trouble, but it was a Union depot, supply depot. A lot of people traveling through and back and forth through here, going into to Arkansas and to other parts of the West as far as field of war. And so he worked here as a patrolman. And that's how he first came to Springfield.
I want to back up real quick for people who don't know. A mule skinner is what?
Just a wagon driver.
A wagon driver. But that was the name for it. So he, I understand he actually worked on the mail route at some point.
At one point, yes.
Yeah. So he comes to Springfield. He's here. Many of us have heard about the duel. And before we get into that, let's talk about his opponent. I bet many people haven't heard about him.
It's so interesting because Davis Tutt was actually absolutely, in my perspective, a mirror image of Wild Bill Hickok. He was on the Confederate side. His family were slaveholders. They were out of Arkansas. His family came here during the Civil War and moved here. But he was absolutely a mirror image of his activities and what he had done and everything about him to Wild Bill Hickok, except on the other side, on the Confederate side.
So what happens that brings these two mirror image men together?
When the war was over, a lot of these young men had nothing to do. And they had lived a rough and tumble life, and they had nothing to do, so they spent most of their time either gambling or chasing women or something of the sort, and didn't really have a thought about the future or having a career or anything like that. They were just getting by day to day. And so they met, Hickok and Tutt gambled together and were more than acquaintances, apparently. But over time, they had a falling out, and this is where the story gets way spread out, because it's so romanticized and so fantasized by people that wrote these dime novels. Was there a woman involved? Was it about a horse? Was it about this, about that? Nobody knows for sure what really precipitated the falling out, but the crux of the falling out was a gambling debt. That Davis Tutt said that Hickok owed him money, and Hickok said, "Oh, I probably do. I probably owe you some money." And Tutt quoted a figure, and Hickok said, "No, it was half that." And so the argument continued, and two young hotheads. And ultimately, Tut took Hickok's pocket watch and took that as collateral for the gambling debt and said he'd give it back to him when he got his money. And Hickok warned him and said he better never see him wearing that watch.
Why was that important?
Or carrying that watch.
Yeah.
Just the idea that it would be, he would take it personally. I mean, these are young hotheads. This is you better never do that, one of those deals.
Okay.
And so word got back that he was going to come onto the square with the watch. And so a day later, that afternoon, Tut walked into the northwest corner of the square, up in the corner where you can walk from Olive Street down alongside the Hearst building. He came into the square from that corner, and Hickok came up South Street and stepped into the square from South Street. And just almost immediately, they pulled their guns and fired, both of them. And Tut missed, and Hickok did not. And so Tut fell dead on the courthouse steps. The courthouse sat where the Hearst building is now. And Tut fell dead on the courthouse steps.
So when we think about these kinds of duels, we think about your back-to-back, and you walk 10 paces.
You're using the
that's not exactly what happened.
You're using the verbiage of a duel,
yeah.
But this was not a duel.
This was
and
not.
The U.S. Department of the Interior classifies this as the very first Old West gunfight, where two men walk into a square or some area and pull their guns and fire. There weren't seconds, there weren't rules, there weren't counting of steps, none of that had gone on for centuries before. It was just walk into the square, pull your guns and fire.
And because this is the first of its type, is that what makes Wild Bill such a figure? Does this launch him into that?
The writing of the romance, of the dime novel, that's what made him a figure. Because he stayed on here. He was charged with manslaughter, and he was acquitted. They said it was self-defense, and he was let go, and he stayed on. He actually ran for city marshal that fall and came in, I think, third, because people thought he was too much of a hothead. And then after he lost that election for city marshal, that's when he left and went out west into Kansas.
So there are a lot of stories about him. How many are anywhere near true? Do we know that?
There's no way of knowing. Yeah, there's a lot of stories about him. I mean, there's stories about how he got the name Wild Bill. I mean, his name wasn't William. Why would he be Wild Bill? And one of the most interesting stories is that his lips protruded, and you can see that in some of the photos.
Yeah.
His lips stuck out. And so as a child, the other kids had called him Duck Bill. But then as he became more and more aggressive and more of a hothead and a great shot, they kind of went away from the Duck Bill thing, and it became Wild Bill.
So he goes on from here, and he goes...
It goes out into Kansas, and then from Kansas he goes north into the Dakotas, and he gets involved with Buffalo Bill. He's in the Wild West show for a period of time. His health fails, his vision fails, and ultimately he was always a commanding person and could command where he sat in a room. He always sat with his back to the wall so he could see the entrance. And he was in a gambling parlor saloon, and by then his vision was bad enough and his health was bad enough that they didn't let him sit with his back to the wall, and a guy came in and shot him in the back.
Shot him in the back.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a legend I've heard here in Springfield that the particular hand he had was called a dead man's hand or something like that?
Aces and eights.
Is that what it was?
2 black aces, 2 black eights.
Okay. And that's where that came from, is from him.
Yeah.
I didn't know if that was true or legend.
That was true. Aces and eights.
I've heard that around here. Now, the museum, the History Museum on the Square, if I go in there, can I...
We have a nice exhibit. We have a depiction of the square, so you can see what it was like to be on the square back then. We have a great set of photographs of Wild Bill from the very youngest on up. We have not the originals, but weapons like he would have used. Playing cards, as they looked back in that era, they look totally different than playing cards do today. Things like that.
Is this important in any way, shape, or form to Springfield, or just in particular to Wild Bill and his legend?
I think people need to really understand how significant Springfield was in that era. It was a crossroads. Springfield has always been a crossroads community, even from Native American time. But it was a crossroads and a jumping off place. When you left here and went west, this was the last bastion of civilization. And so the people going to the gold fields in the 1840s and 50s and so on, and then on up into the 60s and even the early 70s, the travelers that came through here, this was a significant community for them as they gathered their supplies and gathered their ability to move on to the west. And also it was a crossroads town for Native American tribes. Many of the tribes from the East Coast were resettled here and then forced to leave here and move on west as this became more and more occupied.
And we're going to talk about the crossroads and 66 and some other topics in future segments.
Yeah.
John, thanks for coming in today.
Happy to, anytime.
All right. This is The Place for History on the KY3 Digital Desk.